sperm cells, your pollen. Okay? That's really important because, again, that allows you to be even farther away from each other and still have reproduction. All right? And it's not random, it's targeted. All right? The other part of flowers is that flowers have ovaries. And ovaries can develop into protective covers around those seeds. They can develop into fruits. They can develop into delivery mechanisms, so ways of spreading those seeds around. So you can modify that ovary in different ways to enhance the spread of your seeds. All right? So that's what the flower allowed plants to do. Major change. Now, not all angiosperms, so all angiosperms have flowers, not all of them actually depend on animals for fertilization, but a big chunk of them do. Okay, so let's take a look at this in a little more detail. All right, so evolution of plants. The precursor to land plants was an aquatic protist, photosynthetic, green algae. All right, we'll see a picture, it has a plant-like structure, but it's not a plant, it's a protist. All right, and it needs to be in the water because if it gets out of the water, it's just going to dry out, it's going to die. So the first thing was developing a way to come up on land. And at that time, that meant there still had to be some physical contact with the water. And plants did not grow upright. They grew horizontally. All right? And then, so that's your charophyte. All right? And then we have this, well, then we got the vascular system. We got upright growth. So the ability to grow straight up was a huge step. Because if you're all growing horizontally, and you need light, right? You're all basically competing for space to absorb that light. You got one plane in which you can do that. You can go east, west, north, south, but that's it. All right. But now, imagine that you can now actually lift yourself up off the ground and start putting your photosynthetic structures off the ground. Whoa. Now, I can spread out over my neighbors and claim more of that light. All right? But, of course, in order to do that, you have to be able to move the water from where you have contact to where you're not in contact anymore. All right? So that's where the vascular system became very important. But that was a big innovation there, to be able to grow vertically. All right? Then we have this period, what we call the Carboniferous, where particularly the plants that evolved here grew extremely well during this period. So, we're all really worked up about how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, and we need to be worked up about how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. But today, we're at around 427 parts per million. I think I've told you when I was roughly your age, slightly older, it was 320 parts per million, so we've gone up over 100 parts per million, basically increased by a third in that amount of time. During the Carboniferous, it was up around 1,000 parts per million. It was much warmer, it was much more humid, land masses were differently arranged, so there's this massive plant growth, and also this massive die-off and massive preservation of that organic material that eventually got converted into coal. Right? So that's where coal comes from. And then things started drying out, got cooler, got more stressful. And that's where the seed then became an important innovation because it allowed plants to exist under drier, less nutrient availability, less water available. That's where the seed came from. All right? And then we get the flowering plants, which was just an improvement on the seed-bearing plants to start with. All right, so plants, the first kind of record of plants on land go back around 470 million years ago. Now, there were animals in the water. There were no animals on land at that time. All right? So, if you think about what Earth looked like 470 million years ago, it didn't look anything like what you see today. You got to imagine basically bare rock. All right? Soil did not exist. Because in order for it to get soil, you need plants. Now, there's some discussion about whether fungi had already evolved to the point where they were up on land as well, and they helped plants get themselves established on land. One book I read suggested that that is the case, that plants were able to move on land because fungi were there, and they had these they formed that mutualistic relationship, the mycorrhizae that I've talked about, that helped the plants gain nutrients. And it makes some sense because, again, there was no soil. There was just rock. Probably there was probably some dust. There was probably some eroded mineral material, but there wasn't soil as we think of soil, dirt. All right? So anything that would have helped plants gain nutrients from whatever was there would have been an advantage and would have helped them get established on land. All right? So probably there's some early fungi that helped that evolutionary step take place. All right? Then we get the vascular system. We get roots and leaves and stems, stomata. Stomata, very important innovation, because without stomata, you can't control your water loss. All right? So the cuticle and the stomata together are very important because well, the cuticle came first and then the stomata. That's how plants were able then to regulate their water uptake and their water use and limit their water loss. All right? And then we get that upright form. All right? And that turned out to be just super innovative because plants just went crazy at that point. That's the Carboniferous, about 350 to 300 million years ago. Then we get the gymnosperms, right? And now we really see plants really spreading throughout. Okay, and in the meantime, by the way, they're making soil. All right? So as plants are on the land, they're chemically weathering the rock. The rock is also being physically weathered. And then plants, as they die, they're adding organic material to that weathered rock, that mineral part. And as you do that, you get soil. That's what soil is. It's a combination of ground up minerals and plant material. All right? And that then allowed plants to develop roots, extensive root systems, right? And that just was what we call a feed-forward system. It just reinforced itself, all right? So plants, then the gymnosperms came. They were around for quite a while, and they were really good at growing in areas where there wasn't much nutrients available, where things got dry. That's what they're really good at, okay? And then somewhere around 140 million years ago or so, the first flowers showed up, and the angiosperms came into existence, and ever since then they've been very successful. Doesn't mean we don't have these. We have all of these still, okay? But the angiosperms really took over. And they're the ones that actually could really go into the really dry environments, all right? The plants that you see in the deserts, those are angiosperms, all right? So Simultaneously with this is as these plants were developing, animals were able to then start moving onto land because there was something for them to eat. There was a habitat in which they could exist. Prior to plants moving on land, there were no animals on land. So, first fungi, then plants, then animals. No plants, probably no animals. No animals, no us. Okay, so we have the four lineages. We have the non-vascular plants, the bryophytes, consist of three groups: the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses. You should have seen at least two examples. You saw mosses and liverworts in lab. All right. Then we have the vascular seedless plants. Those are the lycopods, the horsetails, and the ferns. And then we have the gymnosperms. Think pine trees, fir trees, Christmas trees. That's your basic gymnosperm, but it's more diverse than that. And then you have your angiosperms. Basically, think plants with flowers. All right. So there's your precursor to the land plant, the stonewort, corales. All right. There's the green. We refer to as green algae, green plant-like protists. All right. And I want you to pay attention to this structure here. All right. It's already showing this kind of vertical, this ability to go vertical. But in this case, it could go vertical because it's in water. Remember, water is dense, so it can hold it up. If this plant had been on land, it would flop right over. Okay? We actually have these plants growing on campus. Down the ponds behind the village. And you know, any of you live in the village? No? Nobody here is in the village? Yeah, okay. So there's two. Okay, two big ponds behind there. And in those ponds, you can find these plants growing. So those are the modern versions of the ancestors. All right, so the reason I point this out is because the innovations, the structures that we see in modern plants, the genes, the codes for these structures were already there in place. Okay? And so what we see is basically modifications of these things. All right, so let's take a look. Okay, let's take a look at what these plants look like. So here are the mosses. All right, mosses you find generally in wet, cool places. All right? They don't have a root system. They don't have a vascular system, so they have to stay relatively small. They have to stay in contact with water because they have to absorb that water. Water has to diffuse into it. They don't really have any way of getting that, moving that water around. They don't have any protection against drying out, so they need to be in a cool, damp place. So generally, you find them around rivers, you find them maybe near lakes, any kind of wet area. They like acidic places. And places in the shade, all right? Because shaded places, they don't dry out as quickly, typically, all right? Now, mosses actually are pretty amazing. They can dry out and then get reconstituted in the sense that they can then get exposed to water and come back alive again. Yes?
Doesn't matter the
Yeah, hold on, sorry, couldn't hear.
Doesn't matter the time.
The time? How long? Good question. I don't know. I'm guessing to some extent, but I don't know how long that period is. They have the ability, so they can hold, I forget now, I don't remember the exact number, but it's something like 300%. They can hold a huge amount of water relative to their own weight, like 300 times their own weight in water. So they can hold a large amount of water. All right. During the Civil War, they were used to prevent infections. So soldiers who got wounded, they had open cuts. Antibiotics didn't exist. Right? Antibiotics didn't come into existence until after World War II, so after 1945. That's how recent antibiotics are. So, Civil War, 1860s, all right, 100 years before that, essentially. And basically, if you got hurt back then, in fact, most of the deaths during the Civil War were not from actual being shot or stabbed, but actually from infections from being shot or stabbed. But to limit that, to prevent putrefaction of the wound, infections basically, the doctors were using moss to pack around them because it actually works as a kind of like a natural antibiotic because it's very acidic. It actually keeps the growth of bacteria down. All right. Today, mosses are a very important horticultural plant. They're used for landscaping. They're also used because they hold water. They're used for packing material to keep things moist during the travel, the transport. All right. Then we have liverworts. As you look, these are not vertical. These are horizontal growing fleshy plants. Again, they have these, this ability to absorb and hold water. They have these Jenny cups here, so it's a form of reproduction that they form. Again, you find these in cool, wet areas. I think they're more limited to limestone. We don't see liverworts around here really that much, but if you go to England, and you go to some of the old ruins or whatever, and you find kind of like a dark tunnel, kind of, you'll find liverworts growing in there, or on the walls of these old castles and forts and things like that. And these are all kind of mostly limestone. And then we have the hornworts, similar to liverworts, but they actually do have a vertical structure, a horn-like structure. All right. So those are the most primitive, if you will, of plants that exist today. These plants don't have a vascular system. They don't produce seeds. They don't have flowers or anything like that. So they reproduce through spores. Then we have the lycophytes. All right? We have Lycopodium. These are club mosses. All right? The name's a bit confusing because you think it's a moss. It's called a club moss. And it was called that because people probably thought it was a moss originally because it looks a lot like moss, except it has this reproductive structure up here. All right? You can find these growing in the woods here in New Jersey. But again, you're going to find them in cooler, damper areas. They do have a vascular system. They don't have flowers or seeds. All right? And you notice they're growing upright. And these are not that tall. But then we have horsetails. All right? These are interesting plants because they incorporate silica in their cell walls as well, in addition to the cellulose. And so pioneers, when they were kind of moving westwards, they would use these plants to scrub out their pots because they're rough. All right? And again, see that structure there? That's the reproductive structure. That's the spore-forming structure on the horsetail. That's very similar to that spore-forming structure here on the club moss. All right? These also can get relatively tall. They get about this tall, about a meter tall or so. And then we have the ferns. The ferns can get quite tall. They can get up to this tall, something like that. All right, previous two. Here they form these little kind of buttons, the sorus, and generally they're either on the underside of the leaves or they're formed on a separate stalk. Excuse me. And ferns are all over the place. Find them all over New Jersey, homestead. Okay, so while these plants don't get particularly tall these days, back in the day, so whatever that was, 300, 400 million years ago, 300 million years ago, they actually got quite, these two here, they got actually quite tall. They were like trees. So these are the first trees, essentially. All right. Now, I want to point out something here because I just think this is really cool. That is a fossil imprint of the bark of a club moss. Now, what does that remind you of? Yes? Scales. Yes. Scales of a snake or a lizard or something like that, that's what they look like. So imagine you find a fossil of one of these trees, all right? And there's this long, scaly thing right there on the ground in front of you. See where I'm going with this? All right? Now, what I didn't tell you was those spores, so that's the modern version of what I'm just showing you, okay? The spores here, they're highly flammable. When they're dry, they're extremely flammable, okay? I had a jar of spores in the lab, in your teaching lab. I was forced to throw them away because they're so flammable. Kill them. It's like, come on, they're in a jar, it's smoking, they're gonna blow up. But, you know, the old movies when somebody's taking a picture in the old movies and the guy's under the hood with the huge camera, and he's got this thing up here and he goes, there's a smile, and he goes, poof, right? That poof was the spores from this plant that they were using. They're actually igniting those spores, and that's when flash, it created that flash. All right? Okay, so fast forward. Yeah, you know, it's the 1500s or so, time of a lot of superstitions, people believe in witches and all that stuff, right? You got this long, scaly thing in front of you, and you know that the plants around there ignite and poof every once in a while, because back then I'm sure they weren't very careful about dropping, you know, coals or whatever on the ground by accident, so they knew that things would go, make this big flame. What looks like that and makes big flames? A dragon. Guess where the origin myths start for dragons? Where you see these. So where you find these fossil deposits, you can trace back the origins of dragon myths. China, that's one area. Europe is another area. All right? Chinese dragons are very different from European dragons. Okay? So, if you find this article here, these are two folks who kind of laid out this idea. I don't know how well accepted it is, but I think it's a great idea. I think it's a really cool idea. And they provide some pretty good evidence for that. So, as far as I'm concerned, there be dragons. All right. Those were the seedless vascular plants. So now everything's reproducing through spores. Okay? Then we get the seed. Seed shows up, makes a huge difference because, again, the one thing that with spores, Okay, spores are very small, so they have a very high surface area to volume ratio, which means they're going to dry out very quickly. Okay? So that limits your ability to reproduce. Basically, when your spores are getting spread out, you need to have the right conditions for growth. Warm, wet. Okay? But if they're not that way, then your spores aren't going to germinate. The seed, on the other hand, the seed, because it comes with its protective coating and its package of food with it, the seed can sit around for, it turns out, up to 1,000 years. Now, most seeds don't survive that. There's special conditions. They have to be in very low oxygen or no oxygen conditions. But even just under normal conditions, seeds can last up to 10 years. So somewhere in those 10 years, conditions will be just right to grow. So having seeds allows a plant to basically become somewhat independent of the environmental conditions and enhance your chances of growing into a full-grown plant, because you can just sit it out and just wait until conditions are good. That's the innovation of the seed. Okay? So, the gymnosperms, they produce seeds. That is not a palm tree. Palm trees are angiosperms. Cycads are gymnosperms. Okay? Looks like a palm tree. I used to think it was a palm tree, but it's not. Well, hey, look at that structure here. Look familiar? Y'all should say, yeah. Looks a lot like that structure there. All right? But now, instead of producing spores, it's producing seeds. Okay? Now, so, not all gymnosperms have needles. They have these flat leaves. Ginkgos are gymnosperms. We have these growing around here. All right. They used to grow in North America. They went extinct. People in the Western world thought they were extinct until they were discovered in Japan in the late 1600s. I thought actually it was more recent than that. I thought ginkgos weren't discovered until like the 1950s in China. But it turns out that it goes back a bit further than that. Weirdly, these plants in the next group that I show you produce this kind of fruit-like structure. It's not a fruit. Only angiosperms produce fruit. But it's this fleshy structure that surrounds the seed. Right? And the reason it's not a fruit is because it's not coming from an ovary. Now, you don't want to be around when those fruit are ripe and falling on the ground, because it smells like somebody threw up.
Rotting fish.
What?
It smells like rotting fish.
Rotting fish, yeah, puke. It's not a pleasant smell. You want to know what it smells like? Probably a little too late. Go a little bit earlier in the year, September, October. Go to Brookdale Park in Bloomfield. They have these trees there, and if you find the right place where they are, and they're in the quote-unquote fruit are on the ground, I swear it smells like somebody just had a bad night and spewed all over the place. It's not a pleasant smell. Now, these trees come in male and female varieties. So there are trees that produce that, and then there are the males that produce the pollen. When these trees were rediscovered, they were used as, and people decided to plant them as string trees. They didn't know about that part, so they planted the female trees until everyone started complaining about the horrible smell. And then they discovered, oh, there are the male trees, look the same, but don't produce these fruit-like things. And so now, anytime you see ginkgo trees planted, they're all male versions. But in Brookdale Park, they planted them before they knew about that, so that's why they end up with the females. Yes?
But if it was all female trees, then they would be.
No, they were male and female,
Yeah.
but they didn't
But
know
the
that.
problem with the male ones is the pollen is really allergenic.
Is it?
It is. So if they were all female trees, then that would solve both problems.
All right, so either you're sneezing your head off or you're retching. Well, yeah, I didn't say plants are all good for us, actually. A lot of plants are not good for us. But yeah, so nowadays, well, they only plant male trees now. And, well, I guess if you suffer from allergies, too bad. That would include myself. All right, so we have the cycads, we have the ginkgos, and then we have the conifers. Except there's one group that doesn't actually produce a cone, they produce also a fleshy fruit-like structure. Those are the yew trees, but they do have these needle-like leaves, right? But most of the gymnosperms are what we call conifers, cone-producing trees. All right, that's typical. That's your typical conifer. That's a pine. These are firs or spruces, probably firs. So there are a variety of conifers. Most common Christmas tree around here is a spruce or a balsam fir. Yes?
You said earlier, like, how you can tell that, like, that's not a fruit. What was
Yep.
it?
How do you know?
Yeah.
You let some scientist figure it out for you and tell you. In this case, actually, it's a little more obvious because the seed is actually exposed. It's not totally surrounded. Okay, but really to know, you have to look to see where that structure comes from. And if there's no ovary, then it's not a fruit. By the way, don't eat that. It's not good for you. Okay. And then there's two more gymnosperms. There is the Welwitschia, which only grows in Namibia. And there are basically this group called the Neophytes. That includes these two, Welwitschia and ephedra. Ephedra, we derive a medicine from that, ephedrine, norepinephrine, sorry. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are derived from these plants here. Don't ask me what it's good for. But this plant's interesting because while it looks like it has multiple leaves, it actually produces 2 leaves. And they can get really big. There's male and female versions as well. And again, as I said, they only grow in Namibia. Very localized plant. And you can see it's pretty barren and dry. Okay, those are the gymnosperms. Then we get the angiosperms. These are the plants that you're probably most familiar with. All right? These are the plants that give us our food, right? Grains, fruit. In this case, I mean real fruit we can eat. They're also the plants that give us the flowers. All right? And they have nice smells because that smell is there to attract the pollinator, the animal that's going to move that pollen around from plant to plant. Now, these flowers can come in a variety of constructions. These flowers here, for example, I'm not sure about, yeah, these as well, are what we call perfect flowers. So the male and the pollen and egg-producing structures are in the same flower. There are also plants that separate these flowers out, but are still on the same plant, so they produce pollen-producing flowers and they produce egg-producing flowers. But they're separate flowers, all right? And then there are plants that's separated out by plant, like the ginkgo that I was telling you, where you have a separate plant that only produces the egg producing structure, and a separate plant that produces the pollen producing structure. And in fact, there is a tree out there called Lombardy poplar, and there's only a male version of that tree in existence today. Somewhere along the line, the females died out. Nobody was paying attention until they realized there were no female trees anymore, and there's only the male tree. So the only way that tree can propagate is through cloning, through asexual reproduction. Very sad for those fall poplars. Okay. All right. How are we doing on this? Okay. All right, so I've talked a bit about this before, but I want to go into this in a little more detail. The transition of life in water to life on land. All right? And plants were the first major organisms to do this. All right? And as we said before, the advantage of being on land is that you had better access to light, especially if you could grow up. You had easier access to carbon dioxide, very important for photosynthesis. But of course, the downside is that it's a lot drier, so you were in danger of drying out, right? So in order to be able to make that work, all right, you had to be able to transport water throughout the whole plant. I didn't put that in there, but you also had to prevent yourself from drying out. Not just your plant structure, but also your gametes. You got to keep your gametes from drying out, okay? Because dried egg cells and dried sperm cells are useless with regards to reproduction. And if you could go up, if you could go vertical, then you have an advantage. Not a requirement, but a real advantage of that exists. All right? You notice I'm far more enthusiastic talking about plants than it was about protists or fungi, right? Yeah. Well, there you go. So, what are the adaptations then that we see that allowed plants to really get established on land? Well, the cuticle and the stomata. I mentioned this before. The cuticle is a waxy layer that surrounds the plant. That's very important because that's what prevents the plant from drying out. All right? But if you completely seal the outside of the plant in a waxy layer, you have a major problem because that prevents you from taking in CO2. So, to get around that, the invention of the stomata was very important. So the evolution of stomata was critical because that essentially allowed plants to control the uptake of CO2 and the loss of water. All right. Then vascular tissue. All right. If you're going to have a complex structure, especially if you're going to go vertical, you're going to have one part of your body in contact with water. You're going to have another part not in contact with water. And the only way that's going to work is if you can transport water from the part that has access to it to the part that doesn't have access to it. So that's the vascular tissue. All right? Lignin. Lignin and cellulose, that's what allowed plants to have stiff cell walls. The lignin especially, that allowed plants to really grow tall. Right? Without lignin, once the plants reach a certain size, they would essentially crush themselves. Okay, because the cells wouldn't be strong enough to stand up to that mass. How strong is that? Okay, imagine the tallest tree on Earth is 370 feet. It's the length of a football field. All right? So take a football field and flip it vertical. And now imagine a structure that is 10 feet across at the base. Okay? Every which way you go. So basically from here to here. All right? That's the base of your tree. That's huge. All right? And it's going 300 feet up. And it's not going like that. You know, it's tapering up slowly. So there is a massive amount of biomass there. All right? Guaranteed, if that tree came down on you, you'd be squashed flatter than a pancake. And yet, the cells at the bottom of that tree are not getting squashed as flat as a pancake. They're staying there. The only way they can do that is because of the lignin. Makes them strong enough they can stand up to that immense pressure that they're experiencing. But it's also flexible, because the more you go up, the more exposed to wind you are. And if you're rigid, the wind is just going to snap your stem. But if you're flexible, you can bend with the wind and you can release that energy. All right? That's why, did I talk about this? That back in the day when the Twin Towers still existed in New York City, the ones that came down on 9/11? If you went to the top of either one of those two towers and it was a windy day, you could feel the building move. It was not rigid. Had it been rigid, it couldn't have been that tall. It wouldn't have worked. But by being flexible, it could dissipate that tension, that force. All right, so lignin, very important. Then, you got to make your gametophytes small, you got to package them, you got to prevent them from drying out. All right, so you package your male gametophyte in that pollen grain, that's that protective covering around it, okay? And you protect your egg cell in some structure, a particular structure. If it's an angiosperm, you're protecting it in an enclosed ovary. And then, of course, if you add the endosperm, that bit of food as well, that allows you to also prevent your embryo from drying out. Actually, what happens is if seeds don't germinate right away, they can go into what's called a glassy state. They actually do dehydrate to a certain point, and then they go into basically suspended animation. I don't know how many of you are, fans of science fiction. They're always talking about suspended animation. That's essentially what it is. But once there's water, they rehydrate and they sprout all of them. And then we've talked about C4 and CAM photosynthesis. These are adaptations to deal with dry environments, essentially. Okay? So, these didn't all happen at once. These are innovations. These are evolutionary traits that develop over time that allow plants to move onto land, to really spread out across the surface of the land and totally alter its appearance. Okay, I mentioned before when I was talking about protists and fungi that plants all undergo alternation of generations. Doesn't all look exactly the same, but it's pretty close. All right? So, the mosses, these are the bryophytes. These are the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses. All right? They actually exist as a haploid organism. When you look at a moss plant, you're looking at a haploid organism. Not diploid like we are, but haploid. One copy of each chromosome. Oh, by the way, another cool thing about plants, they can be haploid, they can be diploid, they can be triploid, they can be hexaploid. All right? Can't do that with us. We're diploid or we're nothing. All right, so these plants need water to reproduce. Okay? So they do produce sperm and egg cells. these egg cells are in an open structure. In order for the sperm to get to the egg cell, it has to swim to the egg cell, which means it needs water. It can't swim through air. It will dry out and die. So, moss can only reproduce when there is water. Like, say if it rains, right? That's enough water. There's just enough water, just a thin film of water for that sperm to swim through the water to get to the egg cell. Once that egg cell is fertilized, you get a diploid zygote. That undergoes mitosis and develops into a separate structure, the sporophyte. So that's the gametophyte, that's the gamete-producing structure, sperm and egg cell producing structure, right? It's on the same plant, or it could be a different one. So here the sporophyte grows out of, attached to the gametophyte. All right? And really all it is just spore-forming structure. That's it. All right? So the spores are formed. This dries out. The spores drop on the soil. They undergo mitosis and develop into the haploid gametophytes, which is what you generally see. All right? So moss typically reproduce in the fall when it's cool and wet, because that allows the sperm to swim to the egg cells and form that structure there. Okay? All right. Then we have the ferns, the lycophytes. All right? Okay, same thing, but now the sporophyte is, so now the dominant life form is the sporophyte, not the gametophyte. So when you look at a fern, you're looking at a diploid plant. When you look at a gymnosperm, you're looking at a diploid plant. When you look at an angiosperm, you're looking at a diploid plant. So only the bryophytes exist in haploid form. All right, so the sporophyte produces spores. They undergo mitosis and develop into the gametophyte. All right, gametophyte has egg-producing and sperm-producing cells. Again, water is needed. The sperm has to swim to the egg cell. You can only do it when there's water on the structure. This structure here, actually, there should have been examples of that in your lab. They're really small, like a quarter inch across, maybe ½ inch at most. All right, so they're really small. And once the sporophyte grows out of this, right, it basically just takes over. So the gametophyte just totally disappears. And the sporophyte takes over, and that's the plant you see. All right? But again, we're going from sporophyte to gametophyte back to sporophyte. Alternation of generations. So these are the two groups of plants that reproduce primarily through spores. Right? Yes, there is sexual reproduction. They still need sperm and egg cells to complete the life cycle, but there's no seeds involved. Okay. Then we have the seed producers. These are the gymnosperms. All right, they're separate reproductive structures. Their structures produce the egg cells. The structures produce the sperm cells that produce the pollen. All right, and here we have. It's not an ovary, but it's a female gametophyte. All right. So these undergo meiosis. They produce the pollen grain, or they produce the precursor to the female gametophyte. All right. And then so you get basically the egg cell being formed. And then you get pollen attaching to that structure, sending in the pollen tube, sending in the one sperm cell that fertilizes the egg cell, and the other sperm cell that merges with the internal cell, the egg cell. And with the other one here, you get a triploid endosperm. That's the seed. When you think of a seed, what you're thinking of really is endosperm. Okay? That's the package of food that goes with the embryo. All right? That surrounds the embryo, protects it from drying out, and gives it that energy to grow initially. Now, the other thing that this does is not only allows you to kind of write out bad conditions, but let's say it does germinate and it's very shady. All right? What that extra package of food does is it allows you to grow up and into the light. So for the first week or two, when this new seedling is growing, it actually doesn't have to photosynthesize per se, because it can live off that food, and it'll get up to the point where it can get light and then photosynthesize. All right? So again, that's what that package of food allows these plants to do, because if they couldn't do that, if they don't have that, they don't have the energy to grow up into the light, and they'll just die. All right, so we go from sporophyte, all right, to the gametophytes, which are now much more reduced. We have now the gametophytes now a pollen grain. The female gametophyte is now encased in a structure protecting it, and it's producing that endosperm. And then we have flowers. Again, this is a perfect flower. It has the pollen and egg-producing structure, the ovary all in one flower. So we get the pollen being produced, all right, producing the male gametophyte. We have the female, we have the ovary, which then contains the female gametophyte that produces the egg. The pollen sends sperm cells down to fertilize the egg cell, and the basically what that cell is called. Anyway, endosperm. You get a triploid endosperm and a diploid zygote. Again, it's surrounded by that endosperm, and then it develops into sporophyte. This is the life cycle in more detail. I'm not going to go through this, but it's essentially showing in more detail how this works. And I also went through this before when I talked about sexual versus asexual reproduction. Okay, angiosperms can be further split into two groups. You're either a monocotyledonous angiosperm, or you're a dicotyledonous angiosperm. Cotyledon is a mouthful to say, so we just call it a dicot and a monocot. All right. There are distinct structural differences between these plants. Monocots have parallel veins, parallel xylem and phloem structures in their leaves. So if we go back, that's a banana leaf. All right, so banana is a monocot. It's big. Usually people refer to the monocots as grasses. So you think grass, something short. But in fact, palm trees and banana trees are monocots. They're tall. All right? And the way we know that is because if you look at the leaves, the veins are all parallel. If you look at the veins in a dicot, they're structured like a net. Okay, they're web-like. So, big difference. But it's not just there. The name refers to the cotyledon, what's called the seedling. So when, let's say, your beans, paying attention, when your beans germinated and first started growing, that's what they produced. Those two leaves. These are the cotyledons, the cots. Okay? Technically, they're not leaves, but they are photosynthetic. All right? The next set, right there, those are the first true leaves. That's mostly what you see when you see your bean plants growing, right? but they started off with this. So dicot, 2 cotyledons, 1 monocot, 1 cotyledon, there's 1 seed leaf that comes out. If you see grass grow, you see that, you just see the leaf. All right? So that's where the name comes from. There are consequences. One is that you have parallel veins versus reticulated or web-like. Also, the vascular bundles are arranged differently. That has important consequences for really how big and how wide these plants can get. So, in monocots, the vascular bundles are spread throughout. All right? There's no organization to it. They're just diffused throughout the stem. On the other hand, in dicots, the vascular bundles arrange in a circle. Why does that make a difference? Because what happens is in trees, those vascular bundles fuse and form a single ring. And then what it allows you to do is add rings to the outside year after year. You can't add rings to the outside here. There's no way to thicken the stem out other than to add kind of more of these parenchyma cells. So palm trees don't get very wide. Banana trees don't get particularly wide. In fact, palm trees get wide because they're adding a leaf basically on the outside each time. But here, because you've now got them in a ring, you can add a ring each year, and that's what thickens out the stem to the point where you can have the base of your tree be 10 feet wide, 12 feet wide. All right? If you go back and look at some of the old pictures of lumberjacks cutting down the forests, all right? They have like 6 guys standing, or a whole bunch of guys standing at the base of the tree, because these things are huge. We barely have these trees alive anymore, but back then they were all over the place, yes.
What about the biggest trees in the world? Those ones, like, you know, I
There's
forget,
one in California.
I forget what they're called, like the big red ones, I think.
Yeah, the redwoods.
How big would it be, like, compared to this room?
So I've never seen this tree, but my guess is the base of the tree is probably as wide as that bottom row of seats right there. Yeah. There are trees in Redwood National Park where you can drive your car through the bottom of the tree. They cut out a tunnel, you can drive your car right through. All right, so at least that wide, because cars aren't exactly, they're not like this. They're whatever, they're 6 feet across, something like that.
Do you know how big they are, the tree? Do you know how old they are, I mean?
Probably 1,000 years.
Crazy.
The oldest trees actually grow in Arizona or New Mexico, somewhere in there. They're actually quite stunted. They're not all that tall. But the one specimen that they found was like 3,500 years old, something like that. I just heard that there's a species of whale out there that can live to 1,000 years.
Wind?
Pretty amazing, huh? No, is that right? No, sorry. 200 years. I lied. 200 years. The bowhead whale.
Oh, yeah.
Whale.
And, where are the sharks that can live like 500 years? Greenland sharks. Greenland sharks.
Those turtles.
Turtles can also live very long, yes. Tortoises, 150 years, yes.
There's also a tree. It's not an angiosperm. It's what's it called a bristle pine that is about a little older than Christianity itself. And
Yeah.
after BC.
No, that's what I'm talking about. These are bristlecone pines. They're like 3,000 to 5,000 years old. And Christianity's been around 2025. I believe that count. So, and then finally, their leaves are structured differently as well. So monocots have the petals are in multiples of 3. In dicots, they're either 4 or 5 petals on the flower. So, but birds are important pollinators. So pollinators are animals that carry pollen from one plant to another. Birds are really good at seeing red. All right, so some angiosperms have evolved red flowers to attract birds. Bees, on the other hand, are attracted to blues, violets, purples. They're very good at seeing that. By the way, they can also see in ultraviolet, so what the bee sees is not what we see. They see something very different, actually. So those kinds of flowers attract bees. And then there are flowers that smell like rotting flesh. They've evolved to attract flies. Flies love the smell of rotting flesh. All right? And so that's one of the biggest flowers in the world, Rafflesia. They flower once a year or once every so many years, actually. And they're the distance between these flowers is actually quite large. So if you're going to try and spread your pollen around, spread your genes around, you have to have a way to attract a pollinator over a large distance. Hence, big stinky flower. All right? And you got flies, and flies can travel long distances, and so they'll come to that flower, pick up the pollen, and then they'll fly around, and they'll eventually smell another dead, rotting body, they think, and then they get to that other flower, and they'll pollinate it. There's a plant that's even bigger, oh God, what's it called? I'm blanking on the name. I'll have to look it up for next time. It actually grows vertically, and they flower once every 5 or 10 years or so. They're huge. The flowers are huge, and apparently they really smell bad as well. And again, it's because you've got to attract a pollinator over a long distance and get that pollinator to travel a long distance to the other rare flower that's out there waiting to be pollinated. So plants have co-evolved with animals to help them transport their pollen from one plant to the next. There are plants that attract bats. They flower at night. So not all plants flower during the day. Some flower at night. There's a plant called moonflower. It's called that because it actually flowers at night. It'll attract moths. It'll attract bats. There are plants that attract mice to pollinate them. All kinds of organisms. All right? But in particular, the coevolution with insects is really quite amazing. Plants that have developed very tight relationships with specific insects. So here we have 2 kinds of orchids, and they are pollinated by very specific kinds of insects, the horsefly in this case, and the tanglewood fly in this case. This fly does not pollinate that flower, that fly does not pollinate that flower. So these 2 have co-evolved. And the way it works is, in this case, that fly has this long mouth, tongue-like structure that is looking for nectar. It's a sweet liquid, all right? So it's packed in sugars. That's what the fly gets out of it. It gets food, it gets energy. What the plant gets out of it is, as that fly is sticking its head in to get the nectar, the plant made it just far enough that it has to jam its head in there to get to it. In the process, it's picking up pollen. And then it goes to the next flower, and in order to get that nectar, it really jam its head in there, and as it does that, it rubs off some of that pollen, picks up some new pollen probably in the process, and it goes from flower to flower to flower doing that. All right? So the flower gets the insect to transport its pollen all around, and the insect gets food. All right? Okay. So this is what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about the seed and the endosperm around. There's your embryo. That's your embryonic plant, all right? And here's where the roots would be, here's where your two cotyledons are, all right? And then this structure here, that's all endosperm, that's all starch, basically. That's just energy waiting to be consumed by that embryo. All right? That is surrounded by the ovary. That ovary can be modified in different ways. It can produce a pod that protects the seed. So when you eat beans, that's what you're eating. You're eating that modified ovary. Okay? When you eat zucchini, you're eating a modified ovary. Alright? A fleshy ovary. You can modify your ovary to have a parachute attached to it. So now you can get your seeds to float on the wind, as in, say, dandelions. Alright? How far can they float? They can really float. Alright? I was up in the Grand Tetons a number of years ago. I was up in the mountains, 10,000 feet up in the mountains. There were dandelions flowering in the valley below. When I got up to the 10,000 feet, by the way, I got there via ski lift. I didn't hike up there. I saw dandelion seeds floating around. So the wind had carried it all the way up the mountain to that place. All right. So they can travel quite a distance. I showed you the coconut seed before. They can float, they can drift on the water and land on the beach, and then sprout roots and stems, and they'll grow a whole new palm tree. A lot of plants produce a fruit to entice animals to actually eat the seed, but in fact, they don't want the animal hanging onto that seed for too long. They don't actually eating the seed itself. They want it just eating that fruit part. So oftentimes that fruit contains laxatives, so that when the bird eats it, it actually gets incentivized to poop it out relatively quickly. But where the plant benefits is two things. One, that bird flies a distance, so it carries that seed away, all right? And two, that seed gets sterilized while it's in the gut of the bird. So, and then, maybe some bird food going with it. If, say, a cow eats that seed, then it definitely comes with a whole load of fertilizer, literally. I mean, just compost right there. Perfect growing medium. All right? Other seeds have hooks attached to them. They work like Velcro. That's nature's Velcro right there. Okay? There's a plant that grows in my yard. I don't know what it's called, but every year I forget about it, and I'll walk next to it, and the next thing I know, like, my whole soil is just covered in seeds. And I think, great. The reason I think, oh, great, is because you can't just do this to get the seeds off. You have to pick them off seed by seed, because they're stuck there like velvet. Yeah. I'm getting rid of those seeds in the garbage, so the plant doesn't benefit. But imagine a deer walking by, and the seeds grab onto the fur of the deer, and the deer walks off. Eventually, those seeds slough off. So that's how those seeds get scattered. Okay, last slide for today. I told you, without plants, we wouldn't exist. All right? 3 major staples, food crops around the world, are maize, wheat, and rice. All right? These are the food crops that have sustained societies, people, cultures. Cultures have built up around these plants. All right? It is the development of these plants that led to the rise of agriculture, the rise of cities and states and countries, laws, culture. All of that exists because you could grow these plants in one place, you could stay in one place, you could make enough food to get through the year. Because if you were depending on hunting for your source of food, You couldn't stay in one place. You had to move around. And you couldn't have 1 million people doing that. You had to be a small group. But once you could stay in one place, and you could feed thousands of people, you start forming towns. In order to do that, you got 1,000 people living together. You better have some rules on how to do that. Because if my neighbor's playing his music at midnight, I'm not going to be happy. All right? So we need to have some rules. Okay? We all agreed? 10 o'clock, quiet. All right? And I'm not going to run my ox cart just willy-nilly. We're going to do this in an organized way. And I'm not going to steal from you. You're not going to steal from me, etc., etc. All right? That's where these laws come from, etc. This is where power structures come from. That's the original maize. That's what it is today. There's the original wheat. There's the original rice. People cultivate